So hello and welcome to the video. This is part 2 of the story of my tier point run from Dublin to Los Angeles and back again. In this video I shared how the outbound journey went, quite good if you haven't seen that video, and I also talked about some of the things you should consider when preparing for a trip like this, and I shared a few tips about how to make the trip as easy on the body as possible. In this video I'm going to talk about the return leg and things didn't go to plan. So I'll share what happened and I'll give you some tips as to what you might experience if things go wrong for you as well. And I'll give you some advice on what you should do if they do. And I'll also share what I did on those 3 days I had in Los Angeles. And finally, I'll answer the very interesting question of how do you get out of Heathrow's Terminal 5 if you're airside and you decide you don't want to fly. So if that sounds good, stick around. Hi, I'm Matt and this is Matt's Planet. I aim to entertain, educate and inspire with my travel adventures from planning to execution. I'll show you how you can travel in style for a lot less than you'd think. So subscribe so you can come with me. So what did I do for 3 days in LA? Well, I took an Uber down to Long Beach and I went on a cruise. So the fare I got was cheap because I started outside of the United Kingdom and went back through the United Kingdom to get to North America. It was also cheap because it had a 6-month advance purchase rule applied to it, and it was also quite cheap because there's a restriction that only allows you to fly across the Atlantic on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday or Thursday in both directions. So if you buy one of these tickets you have to basically spend a weekend in North America. So I was looking around wondering what to do in LA for a weekend, and I started looking at hotels and they were coming out to be quite expensive. So I looked, well, what else can I do while I'm here? And so I booked myself on a cruise. So for the next 3 days I'm on the Carnival Radiance down to Ensenada and back. Should be fun. But not just any cruise, a 3-night Carnival party cruise. The ship was rammed. It has a double occupancy capacity of 2,764, which is how many people will be aboard if every cabin has 2 occupants. But there were so many bachelor and hen parties, birthday groups, reunions and wedding parties that they managed to cram an extra 1,000 people aboard, filling virtually every bunk and pull-out bed available on the ship. There were 3,700 guests in total, and I reckon every single one of them had bought the drinks package. I saw some epic drunkenness, but the highlight was probably the young woman who was devastated to hear that she'd reached her 15-drink daily limit, so had been cut off at 5 p.m. I had a great time. I have a second channel where I share my cruise adventures, that's Matt's Oceans, and a few videos about that cruise will appear over there in the next few weeks. So head across and subscribe if that cruise sounds interesting and you'd like YouTube to let you know when those videos go live. So there you go, 3 days on a cruise ship and I had fun, which is fortuitous because Carnival markets itself as being the fun cruise line and it didn't disappoint. And if you have to spend a weekend at your turnaround point on one of these trips, it really is worth considering once you factor in hotels, food, transport, bit of entertainment. I mean, those theme park tickets are not cheap these days. Then a cruise can be a very cost-efficient way to pass the time. Anyway, that's over now. I've got another night in the US before I start my trip back, so I'm heading into Long Beach to pick up a rental car for the day, to pootle around a bit and perhaps do some shopping. So the fun's been had and it's time to head home. I'm at the car hire return drop-off waiting for the bus to the terminal. So today I have 5 consecutive flights, back to back to back to back to back, which sounds terrible, and even to me that sounds pretty terrible, but oddly I find this a little easier going this way than I do coming the other. But we'll see how it goes today, and at least on this one we have a scheduled sleep opportunity with the overnight transatlantic, where I haven't decided exactly what my strategy is going to be, but I do have the opportunity of actually going straight to sleep, skipping the catering and seeing if that refreshes me for the 2 more flights I've got when I get back to London. So here comes the bus, let's go to the airport. My first flight was from LA to Charlotte and I reviewed it in this video. Without spoiling that video, I'll say here that the flight was okay. Not the best seat in the world. I'd probably struggle to sleep in it if I was on an overnight flight, but it was pretty comfortable, and probably the biggest compliment you can pay it is that it really didn't feel like I was in it for 4 hours. Some good food, some good drink and some good entertainment if you've pre-prepared a device to be able to accept it. And overall, it was a good experience. A couple of hours now here in Charlotte before my next flight. 1 down, 4 to go. I quite like Charlotte as a transfer point. The terminal is very manageable and there's some very cheap duty-free too if you're flying out of the country from there. It's a little like Doha in that it's so dominated by one airline that you really struggle to see planes from anyone else. And despite being an American Airlines hub, it doesn't yet have a flagship lounge, although some construction work was underway when I visited, so perhaps that's going to soon change. The Admirals Club was nice enough though, quite a sizable space, cavernous almost, with lots of dark woods as you often see in Americans' older lounges. There's a manned bar with some free options and premium brands available for purchase. Not great food options, hot options are chili or soups, but there's also a salad bar, although the chocolate covered cranberries were superb. The next flight up to JFK was showing us departing on time, so I headed to the gate and was quickly on board and settled in. And it was at this moment that things started to go wrong. The captain thanked us for boarding promptly and told us that as New York was experiencing very heavy rain, we hadn't been given an arrival slot, so wouldn't be going anywhere for a little while. I only had a 90-minute connection in JFK, so this very quickly became a problem. We sat and eventually pushed back 90 minutes late. My connection buffer had disappeared. During the flight, I had used the 20 minutes of free internet access American gives you in return for watching an ad to see what was happening in New York, and I could see from flight radar that my onward flight was showing a 25-minute delay. So when we made up 17 minutes in flight, it seemed that I would have 42 minutes to connect. So as the plane's door opened, I was optimistic I was going to make my connection. We pulled up to gate 33 in Terminal 8, which is as far as it is possible to get from gate 20, where my onward flight was departing from. There were quite a few people with onward connections, so I'd hoped to see a group of ground agents waiting to assist us to make our connections, but nope, there was nothing. So I left my camera rolling and got a shift on, but it still took me 7 minutes to get from one end of the terminal to the other. I'm not sure at my age and with my knees that I could have done it much quicker, although I thought I'd still have well over 30 minutes in the bank. But when I rounded this corner, instead of seeing the last few passengers boarding, I found a deserted gate with a closed door and was greeted with...
Don't tell me you're Mr. Jones.
Yeah. The plane was actually still there, but boarding was complete and the paperwork was done, so there was no way of getting aboard. I found out later that the heavy rain meant that the airport had had to increase the gap between planes on the runways, which slowed the throughput of aircraft. Instead of spreading those delays between arriving and departing traffic, they kept all of the departures on time, which came at the expense of increasing the number and duration of inbound delays. The flight radar delay I was relying on to make the connection concerned the time the plane would push back rather than the time they closed the doors, which meant I missed it by a good 10 minutes. If this happens to you, anger may be the first emotion you wish to express. Anger that you can't still get on because the plane was still there. Anger that there was no one to assist connecting passengers at my arrival gate, something that is quite normal in other parts of the world. Anger that no one seems to have looked at how I was arriving to put a contingency in place, again something that's relatively normal in other parts of the world. Anger that it felt like the onus was on me to now sort all of this out. But, difficult as it may be, getting home is now in the hands of the very people you are inclined to be angry with. People who probably had very little to do with creating the situation that you now find yourself in. And screaming and shouting at them is unlikely to dispose them positively to going above and beyond to help you get home. So my advice is to smile, make a joke or two, and make them want to help you. But even so, I have to say it was a difficult situation. I still don't fully understand how these things work, but as I'd missed a BA flight, I was now under BA's control, even though I was travelling on an American Airlines ticket. This was quite late in the day and there was one more American Airlines flight leaving that night in about 50 minutes time, and the last flight of the day was another BA flight leaving in about 2 hours. Now, BA and American use different systems, so the BA gate agent wasn't able to do anything to get me on that American flight. He couldn't even see if there were seats available. I'd have needed to go to an American ticketing station for them to take back control of my ticket to be able to do this. And that last BA flight was showing as full, so he could only waitlist me onto it. If I accepted the waitlist from him, then went to an American Airlines desk and found that there was indeed a seat available on the earlier American flight, I would have needed to find another BA agent to release me from the waitlist before the American agent would have been able to put me on the plane. I say another BA agent as the chap who was dealing with me was going home as soon as he was done with me. And he had no idea where any other BA agents may be in the terminal. The departure gate for that later flight was next to his one, but the agents would only get there about an hour before departure, which was after the American Airlines flight would have closed. So even if I could find a seat on an American airline, I'm not sure I'd have been able to find a BA agent to release me. All of this took quite some time, so I accepted the waitlisting and beetled over to an American Airlines desk, which was outside of the Greenwich lounge, by which time that flight had closed anyway, so I wouldn't have been able to get on it even if I'd found a BA agent to release me. BA and American operate a joint venture across the Atlantic, so you'd imagine their handling of this situation would be fairly seamless, but it really wasn't. I didn't allow myself to get angry at the time, but later on I was pretty furious that it was also disconnected. My connection to London and onwards to Dublin was all part of the same ticket. It was protected, so I knew the airlines would eventually get me there. But it felt like the agents wanted me to take as much responsibility as possible for making that happen, even though I was in possession of none of the knowledge of how to do this. So I retreated to the Greenwich lounge, which was blissfully quiet at this time of night, even though I can't show you that, as my focus had perhaps understandably shifted away from videoing everything. And I was waitlisted on the last flight of the day. Now, I could have accepted a downgrade to premium economy to guarantee that I would get on that flight. But I was in a situation where I didn't absolutely have to get home that night, and the prospect of spending a day in New York and flying back the next night was not wholly obnoxious to me. Now, one thing I had concluded was that nobody was going to lift a finger to help me sort accommodation if I didn't get on that last flight. So I spent my time in the lounge looking at hotel options. Airlines have a duty to look after you in situations like this, and a lot of people will wait patiently for the airline to do so. And they're the people you end up seeing sleeping on the floor of the terminal when the airline actually ends up doing nothing, or they do something but it's so late that there are no more hotel rooms available. Now, JFK is not a cheap place to find accommodation, but I looked on hotels.com and found a number of good options for less than £250 a night, which is a fairly reasonable amount for the airline to reimburse you for a night by the airport. I was also very happy to irritate a cabbie by requesting a trip for such a short distance to the airport hotel, so I knew I had a robust plan to fall back on if I didn't get on that last flight. And my advice to you if you find yourself in this situation is to take control of it. Don't wait for the airline to sort you out. If hotel rooms are limited, you want to be in one of them. So sort yourself out, pay for it yourself, and claim it back from the airline later. And about an hour before that last flight of the day was due to depart, I headed back to the gate and explained my situation to the gate agents. I then sat there patiently while groups 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 were all called forward for boarding, and then I heard that magical announcement inviting me to come back to the desk, and they had managed to find me a seat. It was a window seat too, so it was a pretty good one. So I gratefully boarded and settled in for the flight. It was a club suite flight, and I've covered that product a few times recently, so I didn't make a video about this flight, although I did grab some footage of the starter and cheese I had before going to sleep. I will report that once again, BA was unable to execute the flight without anything going wrong. This time there was no Wi-Fi, and they'd neglected to load any menus. Complaint duly lodged, and 20,000 avios in compensation duly received. One day, BA will operate a flight where nothing goes wrong. Surely. Down into Heathrow, and the captain announced that we'd be welcomed by thick fog, which would turn out to be the second major problem of this trip. The fog really didn't look too bad as we landed, but it had been so bad that there were widespread delays. My flight onwards to Dublin was protected as part of the overall ticket, so had already been shunted back, but as I'd allowed myself 4 hours on the ground before my separately ticketed flight back to London City, half of that buffer had disappeared. I never know whether it's better to connect through Heathrow by going landside through immigration, then going back through security to get to the departure gates, or whether you should follow the transfer signage and stay airside. I decided to see how the transfer process worked and should have gone landside. As I was connecting to Ireland, which is in the common travel area, you are streamed through passport gates, which was efficient enough. Then there's a fast track security lane which very comically gives you your own escalator, at the top of which you're just fed back into the same security queue as everyone else. It took a while to get through, and next time I'll go landside. When I first landed, my flight to Dublin was showing on time, but just about every other flight on the board was delayed. So I felt like it was only a matter of time before mine was too, and sure enough, an hour's delay popped up on the departure board. I'd booked to fly back to London City, so looking at their departure board, they seem to have avoided the worst of the fog, so their flights were all arriving and departing on time, which meant that I couldn't rely on my flight out of Dublin also being delayed. If it had been, that would have built back some of the buffer that I needed. So I spoke to BA's ticketing desk in the lounge to see if I could push back my return flight to give me back some buffer. They would have done so, but they would have charged me about £250 for the privilege. The ticket I bought was a really cheap one, which didn't qualify for BA's same-day change privilege. I looked into buying a completely new ticket back from Dublin, but there was so much disruption that day that even the Ryanairs of the world were charging well over £200 for a seat. Flights back the next day could be had for £30, but a night in Dublin is going to cost you probably £200 as well. So I was pretty much stuck, and when my flight to Dublin was delayed by yet another 30 minutes, I made the decision to give up and go home. I knew I would end up 40 tier points short of the 1500 I needed for gold, but I was gambling that I would be able to find a way of getting them that was cheaper than any of the 3 options that I could think of to resurrect the trip I was already on. And indeed I was able to book a completely separate trip, coincidentally to Dublin again, which got me the tier points for a lot less than £200. I've done this sort of trip half a dozen times now, and I've never had to abandon a leg before. And I think I'd have been fine had I experienced a delay in either New York or in London. The buffer I'd built in at the end would have allowed me to cover a delay and a cancellation on any of those legs back. But having 2 delays stack up was what nobbled me, and I was really unlucky for that to have happened. If I'd given myself a 6-hour buffer in Dublin or even an overnight stay, I would have been able to cover both delays and I'd have been fine, but 6 hours hanging around Dublin Airport is quite a lot. So even though this was a bad experience, I don't think I'm going to change my strategy of leaving a 4-hour buffer when I next do one of these trips. If you're super risk and stress averse, give yourself an overnight at both ends, but 99% of the time, I'd say 4 hours is going to be okay, particularly on a route where there are multiple flights back and forth to London every day. So I decided to abandon my flight and go home. But how do you actually do that in Terminal 5? If a mate of yours is travelling somewhere in first class and perhaps you've bought the cheapest possible ticket to allow you to spend the day in the Concorde room wining and dining with them before they leave, how do you then get out? Or if disruptions mean you have to abandon your plans and go home. By the way, I did tell BA that I was abandoning both of those flights, which I didn't have to do, but it felt like the right thing to do. Now, if you ask the Heathrow people, they'll tell you to get on the end of the extraordinarily long queue at the central Heathrow help area in the terminal. A queue that was already hideous because of all of the disruptions, but when you get to the front of it, they will put your name on a list, and once an hour an escort will come and will take you through a normally locked door back to the border, which is a right pain. I did actually find the little group of people waiting for the escort, and some of them had been waiting 4 hours to get out that day. But there is a better way. Get on the train which connects the central terminal to the B and C satellite gates and take it all the way to the C gate and just stay on it when you reach the end. There's no security checks, and a handful of others were doing the same thing on my train. And after a minute or two the doors will close and then it'll travel back to the main terminal and will deposit you back at the border. You then have to go through the passport gates to exit. All in all, it took me about 12 minutes to get out of the terminal, much quicker than the escorted hourly exit process. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed hearing about my dramas. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and leave me a comment. Has this put you off ever taking a TierPoint run? Because it probably shouldn't. Please subscribe if you're new, and if you'd like to support what I'm doing more directly, there is a Patreon account, the link in the description below. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.